everyone, and welcome back to Real Talk. And today we are here with the one and only Howard Chaykin. And as always, question number one, how does the industry know you?
Well, like I say, my name is Howard Chaykin. Lately it's been Howard Victor Chaykin because I'm feeling really pretentious about myself. I'm a more than half a century veteran of comic books. I started out lousy and got good about 10 years later. In the course of that, I did the adaptation of the Star Wars movie, but I really made my bones in the 80s by doing a book called American Flag, then Times Squared, The Shadow, Black Hawk, and the first seriously successful X-rated mainstream comic book, Black Kiss. I spent 50 years of my career working in television on shows I'd never watched, but all of which were there to generate money so that I could afford to do comics again. I've never had a real commercial footprint in comics, but comic books are an inoculated experience. I was introduced to comics at the age of 4, and comics have more in common with the Jesuitry than anything else, in the sense that they're a calling. Once you're inoculated, once you're bitten by this, you either escape it the way an addict sheds his addiction, or you subsume to the addiction and become one of those people. And that's me.
Okay, all right. So, since you've been in the industry for so long, there's one of the age-old questions: is a degree in art necessary to be a successful artist?
It really depends on what you need to get as a result of that degree. I have no education whatsoever. Mm-hmm. I went to school to be a radio broadcaster.
Okay.
And I bottomed out so quickly, it was just, I'm never going to make this. I started my career as an apprentice, but that experience no longer exists. It's no longer available because we no longer have an apprenticeship system because the business is no longer centralized in New York City. A lot of my colleagues are degree-based, and I think to a profound extent, it's probably a valid part of the experience as a self-protection against the occasional loss of commercial value and footprint in the mainstream marketplace that you can always teach, which comes to shove.
Right.
But I mean, I have, as I say, no education whatsoever, but I have friends of mine who do, and it can occasionally create a more well-rounded perspective. But I also think that on top of everything else, a studio experience is extremely valuable. Mm-hmm. Learning studio tools, studio technique, both digital, graphic, and hand. My first job as an artist, and I put artist in air quotes, was working doing paste stuffs and mechanicals for a modeling agency. And I learned how to use my hands and I learned the value of production.
Right.
And production is an important part if you're going to be a serious professional working in comic book business.
Okay. So since we were talking even about the studio experience and the educational experience, what do you think is needed in a portfolio to get noticed?
Well, it depends on the work you're looking for. Earlier today, I looked at the work of a 14-year-old kid who was worked really hard and really had some stuff going on. And I suggested to him that he had to learn how to do basic figure drawing with a bit more conviction. And he had to start thinking of comics from a real beginner's perspective. That he was doing all these very jazzy looking layouts and all this clever stuff. That really didn't demonstrate anything more than that he looked at a lot of jazzy and clever stuff. And that he couldn't do a mainstream, simple, straightforward, blah, blah, blah. Right now, comic books are much more conservative than they've ever been because the market is shrinking. And that there are things that I do in my work that would never be allowed if I were starting out new in Marvel Comics. Marvel would never allow me to do some of the more eccentric things I do in terms of layout. The job you have to do in a portfolio is to demonstrate that you're capable of doing work that's competitive with, if not the best person working ahead of you, then the second best person you've got working ahead of you.
Oh.
And of course, a portfolio is structured with the best piece first, second best piece last, whatever's in the middle carries your weight. And if you're looking for comic book work, you've got to demonstrate that you can do continuity. If you're looking for penciling work, your pencils have to be pencils. If you're looking for finishes, you have to deliver pages that are both penciled and inked. And you have to basically show that you're competitive, because they are the desire in anyone whose work you show to is to say no. No is always the default.
Right.
You've got to find some reason to make them say yes. And that reason is always that I can make you money.
Right. Right.
I mean,
absolutely.
I used to do a seminar at Marvel twice a year, and the motto was, learn to be comfortable with the idea of mutual shared exploitation. You in turn are exploiting the client is exploiting you.
Right.
If you're not comfortable with that, work in another context.
Right.
But if you're going to work in corporate mainstream comics, you are a cog in a wheel.
Right. Right.
Once you take the king's dollar,
right.
You are a corporate employee.
Right.
Don't be a whiner.
Right.
It's not a hobby anymore.
Right. Right. Okay. All right. So you mentioned being a cog in the wheel, right? And there's a lot of people in today's, I would say, generation who are trying to bypass the idea of being a cog in the wheel and being an entrepreneur at a very young age and wanting to start their own comics and stuff like that. Do you think, in your experience, that it would be beneficial to have some of the credits of being a cog in the wheel with a major corporation or industry and then start to go off on your own and make your own products and IP?
You know, I really don't know. I mean, to be honest, because it really depends on what your goal is. And I've always believed in a life of flexible goals. You know, it's, you know, people love, how do you get into the comic book business? I have absolutely no idea. I got into the comic book business by hanging around the coffee room at DC Comics until someone needed a job done. And that's really true.
Right.
It's the way we all got work.
Right.
You know, they need to fill pages, and you were there to fill a page. You may not have been good enough to fill the page they needed you to fill, but they were willing to eat it.
Right. Right. Okay.
And so it's really a matter of if you feel the need to build a creative brand out of corporate work. I mean, the best example of this, what you're talking about to a great extent, you've got like David Mazzucchelli.
Mm-hmm.
David Mazzucchelli does 2 very commercial projects attached as an artist to the work of a very commercial writer. And yet he then leaves comics, mainstream comics, and develops a completely and audaciously different approach to the material. Whether successfully or not, it's irrelevant.
Right.
You know, but he's done it. That's one way. Another is to have a guy like Ed Piskor, who did a very outlandish outside of the world work, and then uses that to leverage a Marvel series, an X-Men series that is very much a transliteration of the same techniques used on Hip Hop Chronicles.
Right.
So it's two streets taken the same way.
Makes sense.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. No. Absolutely.
Okay.
100%.
Okay.
Okay. So my next question is, what tool, like physical tool, would you suggest every artist try at least once?
What an interesting question. You know, I spent the first 10 years of my career as a comic book man totally. But while I was doing that, I was working, because in those days, in the 70s, comic books paid miserably. There was no money at all. And the only way I could make any additional cash to live the kind of lifestyle that a 20-year-old in New York City wanted to do was work in advertising. And what I did, and I worked in a market that no longer exists, which is basically doing comp illustration for magazine illustration, magazine photographers, and storyboards for commercials, which are very different from storyboards for movies. It's a very different franchise.
Very.
Its function is to sell a product as opposed to demonstrate to a director what it should look like. And so I early on developed a skill set of using markers to create at least a quasi-finish to material. I mean, in a modern digital age, so many of those techniques have been absorbed by various digital products like Illustrator, like Photoshop, the Cintiq screen, the tablet, and all that. But I like working dirty. You know, I like having a callus on my middle finger with this elder brush, and I've never ever, even in the context of when I came back to comics, I've never learned to deliver artwork that reflects what people think of when they think of inking, like inking, penciling and inking.
Okay.
I don't know how to pencil for someone else to ink. I don't know how to ink in any real way. What I do is I make black and white drawings that are reproducible.
Okay.
And in that course, I use everything. I work with a brush. I work with Pentel, fountain pens. I work with Sharpie markers. I use Prismacolor black pencil for highlight for edges. Dr. Martin's bleed-proof white. everything. And because I work in everything, and there is no such thing as a perfect surface correction. Because all those mixed media, they counterindicate.
Mm-hmm.
So I use Scotch Magic Blue tape as a correcting tool. You know, I'm very much aware of the fact that my goal is reproduction. I do not care what the artwork looks like in a physical sense. So anything that can make a line is okay by me.
Okay. All right. In your experience, what's more important? Getting it done or getting it done perfect?
That is so client specific. It really is.
Okay.
I mentioned my advertising experience.
Mm-hmm.
One of the push pulls that exist between talent and client is both sides think the other is the enemy.
Okay.
And they lie to each other constantly. I learned early on as a board man, when I did day work occasionally for $150 a day back in the 70s, which was great money. But when I would do freelance, the job absolutely positively had to be in by the end of the day on Friday. It's a lie.
Right.
And I have always believed that if someone gives me a deadline, I will meet that deadline.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Harlan Ellison did a book called a short story called Pen Harlequins of the TikTok Man, which basically is an attack on the idea of deadlines.
Mm.
And I believe it should be perfect on Tuesday. And the client should know out front what he's going to get based on who he's hiring. I'm a brand,
Right.
and I stand by what I've done. And if I say I'm going to deliver something on Friday at the end of the day, I will. But if I know full well that when they say Friday, they mean Monday, I'm going to take it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to make them think I'm bleeding myself terribly to get there on Monday. But there are clients who are willing to extend. There are clients who need it, and the good is the where's the phrase? The good is the enemy of the perfect. Whatever. A friend of mine had a major job to do, a vast job. And before he started it, he had a real crisis of doubt about his ability to deliver. And I said, this guy I've known for, 50 years. And I said, look, it's a big job. Some of these covers are going to be absolutely brilliant. Most of them are going to be pretty damn good. A couple will be average. And a couple are just going to suck. Shut up and do the job.
Right.
So much of perfectionism is based on a narcissistic self-sense that every so often you just got to step back and realize that if you're not screwing yourself out of your next job, be prepared to do your next job. What you got to do.
Okay. All right. How important to the success of an artist, not necessarily the success of their work, but the artists themselves, how important is networking in the industries that you came from?
Well, when I started up, it was the way to do it. It's the only way you got work by dint of knowing and knowing and knowing. Mm-hmm. My first job as an assistant, because I got my first credit at 21 in 1972, 20 in 71. But before that, I'd worked for a couple of years as an assistant for other people. And there was a huge network of guys, mostly guys. This guy needs somebody, this guy needs somebody, this guy could use somebody, he needs some help over here, blah, blah, blah. And that worked. I'm assuming it's pretty much the same way. The community of comic book talent, pardon me, used to be all in New York City because all the publishers were there and everybody had to live in town. That didn't start to fracture until the 80s when the independent market started up and people started using Federal Express. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, everything is digital. But I'm really grateful for the experience I had of being an apprentice, learning my craft and watching other people do it as well. I've always had assistants since that time. I take very seriously the idea that there are parts of my job that I can delegate. Mm-hmm. and I like the idea of having someone clean up after me. I might add, hire an editor. I work for a company with no editorial oversight, and I hired an editor to be a dramaturge as much as anything else, because I believe you need to be edited. You have to have an editor.
Right.
You're not working in a blank jar. So I take very seriously the idea of my career started, as I said, hanging around the DC Comics coffee room, and meeting guys who were working. We were talking last night about First Fridays, which used to be held at Weezy's house before she met Walter, when she was married to her first husband. And that's how I met guys like Al Williamson, Roy Krinkle, Neil Adams, Bernie Wrightson. And you realize that you're coming up against guys who can eat your lunch, and you learn to get better.
Right.
So I assume that kind of the digital networking that goes on today has the same kind of vital health as that.
Okay. All right. Now, you mentioned mentorship earlier, and as an educator, I firmly believe that the educational system should try and shift back to the mentorship idea. Smaller sizes, but be able to concentrate, show them how things are going. Do you think that that's something that could ever happen again?
I don't. I really don't, because we have become a nation of individuals. The concept of individual freedom has so completely conquered the idea and the idea of community that it's vanished. It really has. I'm astonished by the number of people I know, colleagues, contemporaries, anywhere from 10 to 20 years younger than me, who have not experienced the idea of both working for someone else and having someone work for them. I mean, years ago, now over 40 years ago, I was at a San Diego convention, and I met Milton Caniff and Noel Stickles, who had not seen each other in years. And both of those guys had been assistants, had assistants working for them. And I picked their brains for them. I bought them a couple of drinks. And I said, how do you do that? How do you know what to delegate? Where does one end and the other begin? And I can't tell you exactly what they said, because they weren't specific.
Right.
But they made it clear that you're wrangling. But I think we now live in a culture where we are so alone in our dreams and our efforts, that the idea of a shared experience, apprenticeship, mentorship, is almost off the table. I mean, I have a background guy who doesn't come into the office anymore, an old assistant of mine who's moved on, and I miss having someone in the office while I'm working.
Right.
It's more than anything else to yell at, to be yelled at by, and to remember. I shared studio space with Walter when I lived in New York City. When I moved to California, I had a number of studios with young guys, older guys my age, younger men. And there's a crew, and you get a great deal out of a shared community. But I think that communitarianism is a concept that has vanished and died.
Okay. If you had one piece of advice to give someone who is starting to go down the path of illustrator, comic book artist, what would that one thing be?
Be comfortable with your own insignificance.
Okay.
Recognize the fact that you're looking to replace someone else, and you're probably already worthy of replacement yourself.
That's very fair. Very fair. Okay. So I guess that would be the difference between what fine artists think and commercial artists think, because there is always someone who will come behind you and fill that position. So that,
well,
yeah.
I mean, frequently when I'm asked against my book to do a portfolio review.
Okay.
And today was a kid. I wasn't going to say anything to him that,
Right.
If a grown man comes to me, or a grown woman comes to me and asks for a portfolio review, if the work is even any good, my serious question is, whose career do you want when they die, or what do you want to die so you can take over? And frequently they're taken aback by this because
Right.
they know that I'm talking directly how they really think, because that's how they are.
Yeah.
I mean, all about Eve existed for a reason. You know, we're all Eve Harringtons to one degree or another.
Right.
And the reality is that, you know, we are here to fill a space.
Right.
You know, I know a number of illustrators, mainstream illustrators, who started their careers wanting to be comic book men and discovered that it was harder than it looked. I mean, think about comics as a marketplace. These comics are a pointless and frivolous market that is difficult to do well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And because it has a wide ranging affect, and the demands of the form are such that it's almost specific and client dependent.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Marvel wants something, DC wants something else, Image, Boom, IDW, they all want something else. They all think they want the same thing, but they really don't.
Right.
And your job, should you choose to take it, is to accommodate the needs of the client, and without subsuming your own self. But you've got to basically put the client first.
Right.
In those seminars that I talked about, that first day where you know talking about being a corporate cog, I talked at great length about the hobbyism of it all. Since it is a hobby.
Right.
I mean, when you begin to get paid for the work you're doing, you think you're putting one over on someone, because something you've been doing for free all of a sudden is generating cash. And what you have to understand, what one has to learn to do, is that once that dollar is covered, you're not doing comics for fun in your mother's dining room table at night while everybody else is asleep, using the cutting board as a drawing table.
Right.
And I have a reputation for being rather contrarian and difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And many of these young guys were taken aback by the fact that I was suggesting that if you're going to work for this company, you're a comic. But as you said, you work corporate, that's what you do.
Yeah.
You don't have to work corporate. You do whatever you want. There was a kerfuffle about a year ago about some comics broke me.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a series of frankly whiny bleats from people who seemed to think that there was no real gap or air between reading comics and making them. Mm-hmm. That comics were perceived as a completely accessible amateur act. Mm. And it frustrates me because I've spent 50 years learning how to do this for a living. Right. You know, and that there is a language, there is a franchise, and there's a vocabulary to respect. And it isn't, like Robert Crumb once said, it's just lines on paper. Sure. You know, but I think respecting the form and understanding the form has a language and value. Right. Is the first step.
Right. Right. Very true. Last question. The hard question.
This where your scores can really change.
Right. Where can we find your art, and how can we just get to see more of your work and possibly contact you in the future?
I have no website, but there's a Howard Chaykin art website. Okay. You hit me up there. I'm on Facebook all the time because I'm really old and annoying. I'm halfway through doing a new historical comic book, an adventure pulp that'll be out this fall. There's the new Times Squared volume omnibus is out. Came out in February after being delayed for a number of years. I'm very proud of this work. This is signature work. I have a lot of my work. Much of my work is available on Comixology or Amazon. Okay. I don't do a lot of mainstream super duper stuff. Most of my work is historical or crime based. In some cases, erotica. And I try to do work that is more challenging, if I flatter myself a little bit, and I will, than simply guys with lasers coming out of their eyes, or dragons or monsters or mutants and shit. I don't really care about that stuff. I did. Right. That's why I do what I do, but I don't anymore. Okay. I've moved forward. Thanks, Brian.
Awesome. Thank you so very much.
No,
it's been an honor.
Thank you. You got to get out more.